welcome everyone. Ever so happy that you're able to join us today to discuss in so many different angles and so many different ways the extraordinary art of Tatsuzo Shimaoka, who was a living national treasure of Japan, and also to discuss the legacy of his commitment to the Minge movement. He was really an extraordinary presence in our lives here at the gallery. And it's with great, great pleasure and a sense of humility that I wanted to do this focus on his work during our Summer Fine Choices exhibition. Early on in the gallery's history, after working with Brother Thomas for a while, we got a phone call from I think, real estate agent who had a gallery called Art Asia. Linda Beglin is her name, may she rest in peace. And Linda and Nitsa Rosovsky started a gallery for Japanese art and specifically ceramics and specifically Tatsuzo Shimaoka. She had a very wonderful relationship with him, but after many years, they closed the gallery. And along the way, she got a phone call from people, I think in Seattle, saying they'd just done a Shimaoka show and they had 5 or 6 pieces remaining. Would she be interested in them? And she said she's no longer an active dealer, but she'd be in touch. And she got in touch with me. I got in touch with Brother Thomas. And I said, we've been offered some work of a Japanese artist named Tatsuzo Shimaoka. What should we do? And Thomas rarely got very loud and excited, but he got very loud and excited. He said, if ever you could show the works of this man, do it. So we did, and that became the beginning of a relationship with Shimaoka-sensei, who then led us to Ken Matsuzaki. There's a whole network of very positive experiences that derived from that simple phone call from Linda. So I'm very grateful for that. And along the way, I will try to share, if I can, some of my memories of Shimaoka. We had hoped that Mara Williams, curator emeritus from Brattleboro Museum, would join us. She's not well today. Caroline Stoller, who's been working at the gallery and continues to work with us, is going to be her pinch hitter. Andrew Maskey, many of you know. Randy Johnston, many of you know. So it's a pretty good group. And I'm excited just simply to share this together with you today. So Caroline, can we start with the cover slide, I guess? There's everything in this photograph for me, and I'm going to ask Randy and also Andrew to speak to it. There was a gentle strength and integrity to the man himself. He also had a very, very gorgeous smile and laugh, and also an acumen that had to do both with other human beings and with art. And it all comes through in this very beautiful, very posed photograph of him. So Randy, your thoughts?
Well, I met Shimaoka in 1974. He was coming to do an exhibition in Boston and stopped to see Warren McKenzie and also Taiko Tanaka, who was an old friend of his from pre-Warriors. And Andrew and I and Carolyn were talking about passion earlier on, and that passion, I think, was very evident in this. I would consider to be a very humble man. He was very, quiet for the most part, but he had an extraordinary sense of humor, as you mentioned, Bernie. He was quick to laugh. He was always joking, very relaxed with the workers. And he came to ceramics, I think was introduced to Hamada in 1938 or 1939. And then he told me he was drafted and sent to Burma for 6 years. And he carried a tea bowl with him. And he said that kept him spiritually intact, if you will, during the war years. And then when he came back, he re-enlisted with Hamada and served as his apprentice for, I think, 5 or 6 years. And as in the old school apprenticeship program, Hamada helped him establish his pottery, sending a thrower and a press molder with him to help establish that pottery in Mashiko, right next door to Hamada.
And Randy,
Beautiful
how
picture.
does this, I was going to say, how does this picture resonate with you?
It just reflects his persona, and there's a humility, there's a quietness, there's a dedication to his art and craft. In this, he was also dedicated to people. You mentioned in conversation, Bernie, how generous a man he was, and he had many apprentices. He took on the idea of taking foreign apprentices, German, British, American, myself included, and he was extremely generous and supportive of us while we were working there at his studio, and he's very sharing, very inclusive. So yeah, this photo, I love seeing this photo. I had never seen it before, so it's great.
Andrew, your thoughts about it?
Yeah, it's it's really wonderful to see this photo after, of course, not seeing Shimaoka-sensei for quite a few years now. But you may have forgotten, but Shimaoka-sensei was the original connection between the gallery and me, because I was working at the Reischauer Institute at Harvard in 1996 and 1995, 96, and got a call. There was a call in from the gallery saying, we have a potter coming from Japan. Is there somebody you can put us in touch with who could do a interpretation of his Japanese into English? And my colleague told me about this telephone call, and I said, and at the time I was writing up my book on Japanese ceramics, and I said, I can do it. So we didn't even have to look for anyone, because it just so happened that serendipity guided us to each other. And since that time, since 1995, gosh, that's a long time, we've been working together on various projects, particularly with Japanese and Japan-related ceramicists. But one thing I noticed looking at this picture, which is really poetic, I think, and goes to what Randy was saying. If you look behind Shimaoka-san to the right of the screen, if you look very closely, you can see slightly out of focus another gentleman there who is looks like he's gathering up rice straw, like the rope that is around the pot that Shimaoka-san's holding in front of him. And that I think Shimaoka-san himself would attest to the role that the craftsman in his studio played in making his work successful. Because the Mingei ideal was that it is a cooperative enterprise, that people work together in the traditional mode, and both Hamada Shoji and so many other craftspeople in the Mingei tradition used workers called shokunin, who did various operations related to their ceramic production. It wasn't a one-man studio, do everything yourself type of operation. They were the directors. They played a role in every piece, but it was a cooperative effort. And I think that's something important to point out, which just happens to appear right in this photograph.
So Caroline, you never met Shimaoka, and you've had to put up with us gossiping before this gathering. Do you have any initial thoughts before we move on to the work?
Oh, well, I think a good pot represents the character of the person. And I think this photograph kind of, it bridges that gap. You can kind of see sincerity of him. And I love what Andrew brought up with the person behind him. It really is, it's poetic.
Wonderful. So let's begin looking at some of the pieces. I think at this point, the gallery in its collection must have about 35 pieces. A number of them were from our last exhibition of his work, which the gallery over a period of time, with the help of the family, was able to acquire. But Randy, do you want to begin discussing this particular piece, both in terms of technical aspects to it and even the form itself?
Well, I'll start with the form. I think the form is just an incredible classic vase-like form that has its roots in Korean art. And this is a form, in some ways it's an archetypal form that's been passed down through generations. Shimaoka did it very beautifully with the facets and the inlay. And, the techniques that Shimaoka, used were developed, I think, after his stay at Hamada, where he took rope making from his father, the kumimono, silk ropes, and used them as a cord impression. And that was influenced from ancient jamon pots. But his addition to that technique was to begin the inlay of white slips and blue slips into the surface of the clay, and then further the scraping to kind of reveal that texture underneath. Just, very, very beautiful form.
It reminds me that there's a very lengthy VHS video documentary on Shimaoka, and there are two moments in it that I can remember, one of which was that when Shimaoka showed these pots with the rope patterning in it to Hamada, there was a pause, and he said, and then Hamada said to me, "Good idea, Shimaoka." And he certainly took that idea and ran with it for the rest of his productive career. And I just love that relationship of the mentor realizing that what the student was about to do was very different than what he did, but also to encourage him in that direction. And there's a longstanding ability, similarly for Shimaoka, to have Ken Matsuzaki break away in a certain sense by hand building so much of what he did rather than using molds. That represents a respect for the artist or the artisan within the process, rather than need to have replicated everything that you've done before. Andrew, little thoughts about this one?
Yeah, I really like the way that the nuanced the nuances in the rope design that goes diagonally across. So you can see at the top there's cobalt blue. So cobalt blue, a cobalt slip was inlaid, but then another glaze was placed on top of it. And I think, Randy, you could definitely speak more to this, but I guess maybe he applied the blue, scraped it, and then applied the thick milky glaze. Is that a soba glaze? Over the top, and then lightly scraped it again. So some places, like at the top, you see the blue coming through, but other places you don't really see the blue at all, but you still see the rope impression. And then other places the glaze completely, sort of covers that. Is that right, or am I a little off?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, he produced the blue in the slip by adding cobalt. It's like a base white paint, and you add a certain percentage of cobalt oxide or cobalt carbonate to a slip recipe, and then it becomes blue in the firing process. And his idea of layering, I think, was something that was really important, maybe passed down from generations of potters here, but where you begin to put layers of information on the piece. And through the firing process, the heat kind of begins to blend those. And it's it's a learned process through observation and trial and error. And, you know, to his credit, he, you know, developed the inlay technique to a very, very high level of expertise.
It reminds me a bit of the other image from the film where Shimaoka is describing the rope patterning and then putting the white slip in it and then kneading very carefully to sort of carve it down so you didn't get rid of the white, but you left the ridges. And he then said, then you need some little old Japanese ladies to help you do that. So his ability to manage personnel in order to get the effect that he did was always amazing to me. And the generosity with which he at least treated us and the interactions that we had with him was consistent throughout, I assume, Randy, all your time there with him as well. Kindness and respect.
Funny little story, Bernie, is you say that two women did all the scraping, which is rather tedious, but that was their job. And they sat all day with, you know, in the workshop and would scrape the pots and chatter away, telling stories. But I wanted them to teach me how to do it, both the scraping and the rope impression inlay, and they refused a number of times. And I was very persistent. I was 25 years old, and I was determined to learn this. And finally, I asked them why they wouldn't teach me how to do it. And they said, a man's hands are not sensitive enough to do this. So it was quite, but as I look back and reflect back, I think that probably they didn't want me interfering with their job at the studio.
No,
So,
it's a wonderful insight into his ability to keep people with him for a long period of time. And then people like you and others who came through the studio remained, I think, very devoted to him personally. And he, in turn, honored that relationship. Can we look at the next piece?
I wanted to mention real quick
Sure.
with that too, that same thing. I suspect, Randy, those ladies were, I mean, I don't think they weren't making up an excuse. I think they had the fact that they stayed there and did that, just looking at that previous piece, they were doing something special. They felt that their skills were valued and that they were skills. They weren't just, it wasn't hack work, you know, to them.
Right.
They were participating in a very important way in the creation of those pieces. So, but it is funny, yeah, that they wouldn't.
That's a very good point, Andrew. You know, after I left Shimaoka's, I kind of did a lot of reflection and thinking, and it was interesting to me that each of the 12 workers that Shimaoka employed for life were specifically trained for only one or two things. You'd have a worker that only worked on plates. You had one or two workers that only worked on press molding or hand building. You had the two women who only did scraping, and they helped move wood around the kiln and stuff like that. But each worker had kind of a specific role at the pottery. And Shimaoka treated them with great respect. And they worked hard. We worked 7 days a week. And he employed them for their entire life until they died.
Real tribute to him.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Caroline, I wondered if you would like to speak and respond to this rather extraordinary explosion of salt glaze.
Yeah, it is quite that, isn't it? It's the glaze really kind of covers, it doesn't cover up, it really interacts heavily with the rope inlay. What I love about all his work, and I think this one is a good example, is they're so complex, but that's not something that's thrown into your face. They're actually quite humble and quiet in a way, but you can dig in there. They're not just simply, you know, a few glazes and a form. It's really thought of, but it's not overworked and fussy. And I think because of that, you can really approach the piece and fall into it. especially when you're there in person and interacting with it.
Randy, your thoughts about the salt glaze piece and the salt glaze process in general might be helpful if you explain a bit of it to people.
Well, salt glazing, the Germans claim, I think 16th century, the invention of salt glazing, but you can kind of see it on certain terra sigillata pieces that are pre-BC or BC oriented pots from the Middle East, and it's simply at high temperature you introduce salt, which is sodium chloride, and the sodium attacks the silica chemically on the clay and begins to form glass. And the more salt you put in, the more glass that's formed. Don Wrights here in America was the king of salt glaze, and he would get that beautiful orange peel effect. The fifth chamber, I believe, of Shimaoka's, called it the Noborigama, in the back part of his property, was a salt chamber that was used when I was there, and he was playing with that idea. Hamada had also played with salt glazing technique, and it's a very kind of simple way of producing a glaze on the surface of a pot. Whereas if you're trying to make a glaze, a powdered glaze, you have to grind stone, you have to mix wood ash into it and clay, and there's a certain recipe that's followed. Whereas the salt glaze is a very direct interaction between the gas produced when you break down sodium and chlorine. And the sodium, of course, as I said, attacks the silica part of the clay chemically. And the cobalt.
Very beautiful. Andrew?
Yeah, so this is a big piece. It doesn't quite look as big as I think it is, but it's 19 inches, so it's almost 2 feet wide. Here it's on a stand so we can see it, but really this is a piece that I feel sure that Shimaoka-san was thinking specifically as a backdrop for food, something that could be used and do a wonderful selection of sushi, for example, or other. I don't know how it's a little deep. It's probably too deep for sushi unless you piled it sort of in the middle. But this was definitely made with a view towards being used. Although it's beautiful to look at, I think it would be a pity if whoever becomes the proud owner of it doesn't use it for a beautiful array of colorful cuisine at some point.
That's a lovely idea. We had one time a call from a patron of the galleries who had purchased a large Brother Thomas plate. And then at the time, I think the plates were maybe $3,000 to $5,000. But by the time he called, they were more like $30,000. And so he said, we were having people over and we were thinking about using the Brother Thomas plate for a large shrimp salad. What's your thought? And I said, well, if you're careful with it, because now it's worth more like $30,000, I don't think you want to chip it with the shrimp salad. So I think it's a nice idea to use it as a platter, but I think, or as a serving dish. On the other hand, it has such a physical, visual presence, and at the same time is not fussy. It has an elegance to it that I think very much is not the exact adjective I would use for Shimaoka, but it certainly comes through in this piece. Next piece, please. One of the things that occurred to me as we chose these pieces is that in terms of watching pieces that we have had, the shows that we've done, that these pieces all have an individuality. And although there are pieces that come up from time to time in auction, I rarely see a piece faceted like this in this way. So Randy, could you speak just a bit about it?
Well, when I first saw this piece presented, my reaction was it was probably a very early Shimaoka piece, maybe maybe made after like the years immediately after his work at Hamada's studio. It's very robust. I love this piece. And I love the way that he paddled it, fastened it, controlled the neck, cut the foot, and very simple glaze, but very strong form.
Absolutely. In terms of inventory number, that's very interesting. You said that this would have been in our first show that we got directly from him, not the pieces that I mentioned that came to us, but within the first show that we did, which was probably in 1998, 1999. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, he was long out of Hamada by that time, but the idea that, and then I don't remember in any of the other shows having this heavy Temoku glaze on any of the pieces that he sent. Andrew?
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, the word unique gets overused. It's probably not unique, but it's very different from what we generally think of as the Shimaoka's work. But yeah, it has that sort of directness of some of Hamada's work. And the foot being as tall as it is really interesting. Don't usually see a foot this high. I'm wondering, you do see it in some historical Choson period Korean pieces. He may have been looking at some Korean ceramics from the 18th, 19th centuries when he made this piece. So it's interesting.
Right.
We have a question from one of
Shimaoka
the,
loved. Oh, sorry.
This actually might be a question, Randy, you can best answer. One of our viewers is asking how thickly potted are these pieces. I assume she means how thick the walls are. And in my experience, they're not delicately thin, but they're not chunky necessarily. They're in a sweet spot. I've always seen his walls as fairly consistent, but we've only have about 35 pieces in the collection now.
Well, Warren McKinsey joked about selling pots by the pound, Carolyn. So,
oh, no, like his are so chunky.
There are several comments about Mashiko clay. Mashiko clay was maybe considered some of the worst clay in the world, and in terms of it not being plastic. Hence, that it's more difficult to throw in a very refined, thin manner with the clay. Hence, as you pick up these pots, they have a mass and a weight. It's interesting also to me that very much in American psychology, we equate thinness with goodness. Like if it's thin and paper thin, we associate that with a good pot. But the reality for me, of course, maybe it's my own excuse because I throw thick also, but it's there's a substance and there's a balance to the piece, both the visual balance and a weight balance, physical weight balance as you pick up the pot, and those need to be considered. And I feel like there has to be an intention there, and I think this pot reflects that intention. I picked up a Bernard Leach picture, and you felt like it was full of liquid and it was empty. So
Nicely said. Can we look at the next piece? Sorry, go ahead.
And then no, absolutely. I can talk about this fact. I think it riffs off of what Randy was saying. And the question of the thickness is that it's funny when gifts of flowers are brought to the gallery, a lot of the employees and the gallery associates, we often will pick a Shimaoka piece. And I think that has to do with not only are they just absolutely gorgeous and they call to be used, but there's a comfort in them. I think some of it is the thickness of it. You don't feel like you're going to break it, but it's not unaccessibly heavy or anything like that. They're very approachable, and they do look good with flowers in them. But of course, this piece is a pourer and not a flower vase.
No, but what you said is a very nice and thoughtful way to think about his work, which is you want to use it. And the notion of the beauty of use, the yonobi idea really comes through in many of these pieces. This, the katakuchi, the pourer essentially, with this kind of classic beak on it, having the sake taken from a cask poured into this and then poured into a small bottle to serve the sake tokuri really is quite beautiful. But Andrew, do you want to speak just a bit about the form, the placement of the rope pattern in relation to the salt glaze and so forth?
Yeah, this is this is a little unusual in that you have the rope pattern at the top and not at the bottom. And in the same way, the cobalt blue has been applied at the top and applied thinly enough that it doesn't really drip down. Of course, that's part of the firing, this being salt glaze. But would you say that that bottom part, Randy, was probably scraped after the inlay, after the rope impressions had been done?
Well, having not witnessed it, I don't know exactly kind of what the progression of this was, but typically the rope pattern would have to be impressed when the pot is leather hard or soft leather hard.
Yeah.
And also that's when the trimming process of a pot occurs. So, obviously a foot is trimmed. My guess is that the foot was trimmed first on this pot, and then a rope pattern was impressed, and that Shimaoka probably made a deliberate choice only to demarcate the top part of the piece from the waist and the lower part of the piece. And it may bring, it brings a concentration of visual focus back to the spout. I think it works well. It's the katakuchis are kind of a very interesting form that's pervasive in Japan. Is for decanting sake, as far as I understand. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Or soy sauce.
Or soy sauce.
Uh-huh.
It's interesting because some of Ken's earlier katakuchi pieces had this form, and then he's begun to manipulate the form substantially, that it doesn't in any way replicate this shape at all. And it's a very beautiful, beautiful piece. This you cannot see, but it was also fired on seashells. So there's slight indentation. You look at the right where the seashell elevated it so that the flame went all around it. Let's look at the next piece because it's also a very beautiful salt glaze piece. And Andrew, do you want to just talk about this? Because here the rope patterning certainly goes all the way down.
Yeah, but it does, and makes it a very striking piece. But that is accentuated by the fact that, like the previous piece, the lugs and the mouth area, as well as the very bottom, do have neither the rope inlay nor the cobalt blue on them. So that actually makes those elements stand out and give it really a very strong sculptural quality, which is beautiful.
Randy?
Well, I think in this, what Andrew says is correct. And the other thing I admire about these large jar pieces is Shimaoka's skill in kind of giving what Jan and I refer to as the breadth of the pot. So, there's a fullness of the curve and of the volume of this pot that is, I think, wonderfully done. I like the way that the handles are, left white, and they join the white area of the piece with the blue area of the piece. I always loved Shimaoka's handles, the way he, would pinch them on and then he'd kind of poke a hole through them, whereas many potters pull a handle and attach them.
Interesting. Caroline, do you want to put the next slide up because it has a juxtaposition of two pieces where, for the most part, the neck of each one is not as treated as the body or the bottom part of each one of those. And Andrew, I'm going to ask you just to sort of compare and contrast these two forms.
Yeah, so the basic form is relatively similar. If you look at the base, the body on the right one obviously swells more like what's called a abacus bead shape in Japan. The other one is more rounded, more like a European shape, actually. But the rope pattern at a diagonal, they're opposite diagonals, opposite directions, but is similar. And the use of the slip, the cobalt blue on the left and the iron brown on the right, both are applied to the areas that the rope impressions are found. And the mouths are remarkably similar as well. The one on the left has the lugs, as we've seen, but the one on the right has incisions or cuts vertically. I have to assume at 4 places, probably 2 more on the back as well, that add a bit of visual variety to that form, and sort of a bit, I don't know, bring sort of a focus, which wouldn't be there if those were omitted and it was simply, you know, the same all the way across the top. So when you do that, when you do this and you sort of break down these pieces, you really see, you get some insight into Shimaoka-san's thought process in creating these pieces. Sort of, it's not random, it's not spur of the moment. He thought out what he wanted to do. He may have made some changes as he was doing it, but they're really very thoughtfully executed with a vision of what he wanted to end up with, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
No, but also after having looked at the Katakuchi with the bottom part, not with the rope pattern, now it looks like that he's done it now with the piece on the right here. And Caroline, do you want to put the single image of that up and then talk a bit about it?
Oh, talk about this one here.
Sure.
This one's so interesting because I think all of his pieces, in the true spirit of what Mara would say, is that each of the pieces with this rope rolling, they just dance. It's so much fun because it's a thrown piece, which naturally is going to have a sense of motion to it. And then with adding the rope rolling on top, it just visually lifts it because you're giving these angles. But this one kind of has a different voice with putting these strong indentations in that area. It gives this sense of robust. It almost stops that flow a little bit and gives it a sense of kind of like a muscular, you know, like a bodybuilder or something like that, which is quite different. But that goes to what Andrew says. He really has a specific voice that he's trying to put to each pot within his repertoire of marks, I'd say. But then he lets it take natural course. I mean, in this picture, you can see here where the ash has just taken over in some areas. It regrounds the piece too, and in the process, and in a little bit of a uncertainty of firing, which I'd say most of us love. This piece
Absolutely wonderful, wonderful point, because I think one of the aspects of having the gallery and having a shipment come in of 20, 30, 60 pieces is you don't have the opportunity, or don't take the opportunity, to look at them individually. And this opportunity of the WebinART gives us that chance, and also now to move to a totally different aesthetic, I think, in this rather extraordinary plate with the various patterns plus the enamel work. And talk about dancing. There's a lot of movement in this in terms of the scalloped inner pattern. Randy, thoughts?
Well, he sets up a rhythm and a cadence, Bernie, and you're touching on that, you know, with the different row patterns and the mark making on there, and then finally finishing it up with the overglazed enamel, which adds, you know, little elements of color, which kind of trigger, you know, color triggers like emotional response in us as humans. So, and in that where the dark rim kind of contains all that visual information on the inside. So exquisitely done, masterfully finished piece. Some of his pieces are more robust and kind of more gestural, and this is reflects back on what Carolyn and Andrew were talking about, where the pot has a very clear intention, and probably from when it's initiated as a lump of clay on the potter's wheel, that there's an intention as to where this pot or what this pot potentially could look like when it emerges from the kiln.
Caroline, would you put the next slide up, because it has two works, and Andrew, I'd like you to sort of talk about them, because you have an enlarged space with the enamel work, and then the enlargement of the design itself on the vase, and then the plate next to it, and also gives a sense of the scale and the use of the rope patterns.
Yeah, well, one of the really interesting things that we see in both of these are the rondelles, these circular areas that have the overglazed enamel, red, green, and yellow details or motifs added to them. And that derives from textiles of the Edo period, where they used a wax resist to create those sort of round, usually round, they could sometimes be square or other shapes, but those areas in fabric. So that's transferred here onto into the ceramic medium. It was done earlier in pieces by Hamada, and that's no doubt where Shimaoka-san got it. But in these pieces here, we see on the right, those arranged in basically a circular pattern, acting as sort of the centers of petals of maybe a flower, what is a sort of floral motif in the middle of the dish. Whereas on the left, there a large one and a small one, or small one and a large one are juxtaposed. And I believe on the back are there two or maybe three. I would suspect that on the back there would be one or three, probably not two, because the odd number is preferred in Japan, so that you don't get squares are not very pervasive in Japanese culture, in a sense. The round and the odd numbered is more preferred. So on the right, we see 6 rondelles, but the round itself is the circular plate is probably the reason for that. And when you scatter them, in a sense, the typical preference in Japan is for odd numbers. And so that's a difference between those two choices for decorating these two pieces. Although the overall approach with the rope inlay, the rope and the slip inlay, and the use of the rondelles and the overglazed enamels is the same.
And Andrew, do you or Randy know? We have a question from the audience. What do those have, the roundels? Do they have specific meaning inside? To me, they look like it's like rice hull seeds at the top, or like wheat, but I don't know if they're actually have specific meaning, or if they represent something culturally that's significant already.
The round part, or the mark?
Yeah,
overglazed mark making.
I think the enamel, like what's inside them. What the roundels represent.
I don't know if they represent anything. I think, I mean, it's just anecdotal, but I just see them as kind of a brush mark making that Shimaoka used on his pieces.
We'll see
I
it
think-
also on a plate later, the one on the upper left vase, that three area piece is used as a design on one of the plates. So it's probably something he was very comfortable with in both instances. And at the very end, there's a square bottle with something similar to the, whatever there are, flowers and so forth, except done in a resist. So let's
Yeah.
move on and we'll come back.
I want to just say, yeah,
Go ahead.
sorry, one thing. Yeah, I think that the more complicated motif may be what's called the inaho, which is a stalk of rice. So the rice as it's ripening, I think that may be what that is. And the other one is sort of a simplified sort of plant motif, which I think is maybe indistinct. It's not specific to something, but the inaho would represent sort of fertility and harvest and bounty and that sort of thing. And that may be why that's incorporated quite a bit on these pieces. And also an opportunity to use sort of all three colors there as well.
He used
Now-
the eggplant design on quite a few pieces too. You know,
Now
they're,
time.
you know, they're not kanji. I mean, there's nothing in writing that you know, signifies any kind of literary anything, I think, but I do think they are rooted in plant-based kind of decorations. And Shimaoka really enjoyed plants and, you know, gardens and flowers and things like that. So it's a natural progression, I think, onto a pot.
Next one then, Caroline. Randy, do you want to speak a bit about this? The surface is certainly physically very different. It's not as shiny, it's duller. And then we'll look at the next piece as well, because it's juxtaposing two pieces.
Yeah,
with the similar-
what a handsome piece this is. And Shimaoka brought in shigaraki clay, which has feldspar and quartz inclusions in it. And again, it's not a very friendly clay to work with, but he made these beautiful pots. This one has paddled and kind of cut faceted faces on it. And then he would put these in what I remember was called the secret chamber. And Andrew asked me what the secret chamber was. And there's a large firebox on his back climbing kiln. It was kind of a modified, the beginning of a modified Anagama, Noborigama type kiln. But it had a large firebox. And then between the firebox and the first chamber, there was a very narrow kind of corridor space that Shimaoka would crawl in on tatami mats on his hands and knees, and he would very carefully just place these pots on their side, hence the shell marks, on the floor of the kiln. And then when the kiln was at temperature for several days, he and the workers would put up side chutes and introduce charcoal onto the top of the pots. And the charcoal would kind of smother the pots and rob oxygen from the surface and produce these really, really beautiful kind of responses in color.
Interesting. So the undulating lower part of it is as a result, do you think, of the charcoal?
No, I think it's cobalt. Yeah.
Cobalt, okay.
Yeah.
And the next piece we're going to look at, the next photograph will just show his chop, which Randy, do you want to speak a bit about chop?
Well, his chop was the kanji symbol for his name, Ta. There we go, Andrew. Thank you for that. And I always, when people ask me if they're looking for a mark on Shimaoka's pasta, I say always look for something that looks a little bit like pie. Maybe it looks a little bit more like the Big Dipper with the top closed over. But I think Andrew could speak to what Ta and then Suzo means in terms of Japanese language.
Yeah, so Mr. Shimaoka's family name is obviously Shimaoka. His personal name, Tatsuzo, is two characters, Tatsu and Zo. But instead of making a chop based on one or the other of those characters, he chose one of the syllabary, the katakana syllabary, the ta, the first pronunciation of the character for tatsu, which is quite complicated, and just used the pronunciation symbol ta as his mark, making, you know, a very simple, direct, recognizable mark that could be placed on the bottom of pieces, sort of in that Mingei tradition, rather than having some complicated marks like some of the tea ceremony ware kilns used, something simple and direct. And I think that's why he chose this particular mark.
Wonderful. Can we look now at a juxtaposition of two pieces and ask Randy, just actually, Caroline, if you just respond to these.
Oh yes, I love these pieces. They're so interesting. They have the shigaraki clay, but not only that, especially that form on the left, which is the one we looked at in the previous slide, that shape is just so exciting. It's a thrown form which has been paddled, so you have this rounded nature meeting up with the squared off sides. Of course, they're not totally flattened, but the cobalt drawing, that wave, how that serves the communication between the rounded neck and then the squared off body, it just marries it together. And it's a very exciting shape. And then he plays with that too on this bigger form. And it's really neat to see how that undulation changes the dialogue. So I'm just sitting here imagining if that wasn't there and if it with it added on, it totally changes the piece and kind of creates this bridge between the physical and the pictorial, because it becomes like a wave. Just love it. They're beautiful.
I was reading something that Hamada wrote last night when he was talking about Shimaoka's beginning to move into natural ash glazing and salt glazing and stuff like that. Hamada, and this is a quote, he said, "That's glazing by grace." I love that.
It's a very lovely, yeah.
The grace of the kiln, yeah.
Yeah.
The Brother Thomas type quote, yeah.
Yeah, Thomas used to call them gifts from the fire. But either way, the notion of these pieces having a kind of energy and presence as we're going through it individually, and I love this aspect of it, it gives a whole different feeling to how we can look more carefully at what we're presented with. The next slide is, in fact, the piece on the right. And the use of the seashells here certainly adds a surface energy to it that would not be there, but it also indicates that it was probably fired, I assume, on its side, so that there's a whole different flow of the fire and the ash around the piece itself. Andrew, just brief comments about this one?
Yeah, it's an interesting choice, particularly juxtaposed with the pieces we saw earlier, that as Caroline said, that line with the cobalt on the lower part is undulating rather than straight. We saw pieces that had a very clear straight line, and here it undulates, and it kind of creates a sense of a landscape, particularly in Japan. If you see in the early morning or in the evening, when you look across the mountains, you see the golden sunset or sunrise above and the dark forested mountains down below. You really get a sense of that in this piece. And it kind of reminds me of works by another Japanese ceramist, Miyashita Zenji, who very consciously used layered clays of different colors to create that sort of mountains after mountains type of landscape in his pieces. But here with Shimaoka-san's work, it's much more natural, at the edge of consciousness. You sort of see it, you sort of sense it rather than see it consciously or directly like you would in Miyashita Zenji's work. So it's really, again, another example of that nuanced approach and a real understanding of both the materials and the process and what's going to result from combining those to create the finished piece.
I must say that we must have, over the times we worked together with Shimaoka-sensei, received in the vicinity of 250 to 300 pieces, and there was never a piece that repeated what had come before. Either he had a remarkable computer in his head, or he had a computer and somebody who knew what he was sending. But that variety is now coming through again as we're looking at these individual pieces. And now we look at this next plate. And Andrew, if you'd like to speak a bit, and this is somewhat that shape that appeared on the enamel work as well, it's sort of dancing.
Yeah, exactly. And that the contrast of the quite controlled impressions on the outer portion of this plate and the drip glazing of the black, the small black in the bottom, which would have come before the white, and then the white on top, to divide this plate into threes in a sense. That gestural aspect of that drip application creates a really nice contrast and almost serves, by the way that it's executed, to set that outer edge in motion. So you almost, right, visually almost see it rotating. I mean, I do see it as if it's rotating around the outside based on those three curved, sort of slightly curved spokes of the white there. So, you know, it's extremely sophisticated. Whether he was necessarily thinking, if I do this, people will get this impression, I'm not sure about that. But the exploration that he did with the techniques that he had to try to create something new, different, that was still in keeping with his overall approach to ceramics and ceramics decoration is really, really amazing, I think.
Randy?
Well, to follow up on Andrew's comment, yeah, he's definitely imparted a sense of movement and motion in this piece successfully. And, you know, just Andrew's comment, Shimaoka had an intention. I, you know, studied and reflected on and observed and developed a process, and he has imparted that into this piece, and the user has a sense of it and is responding to it. You know, Shimaoka doesn't have to be here to explain it. He's, you know, Andrew, through use and just even looking at this piece, is experiencing what Shimaoka intended him to experience. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about, you know, ceramics and pottery and the use of pottery is that, you know, that sort of gestures and information is passed down through many generations. You know, as long as this pot exists and gets passed forward in time, I think that's, to me, it's one of the greatest things about this genre.
What a wonderful way.
We have another question. We had a question about how he got the rope inlay on a concave form. And we should have probably put in pictures of the samples, but my understanding is they were flexible. So you could roll it and you can see where it had to be picked up and rolled again.
Yeah, I can explain it. After the plate is trimmed, the surface of the plate is still leather hard, so it can receive an impression. So the rope impression is put on, 2 layers of white slipper inlaid into that, and they dry to leather hard stage. Then they're scraped with a very sharp trimming tool to expose the dark clay beneath the inlay. And then it's, follow up here, it's glazed with a base glaze called Sekai Namijiro, which is a limestone ash glaze. And then, this gets very complicated, then the white and the black are put on the piece. there's a wax resist layer that waxes out the rope pattern. The white is trailed on. The white and the black are waxed out very carefully with a brush. And then the green, the sagey, which is a copper and a nuka mixture, is added on top. So there's 4 or 5 layers of, again, information that have been put on this plate in a very deliberate manner to create, the final piece and the impression of movement and depth and layering.
And Randy, I think you told me or showed me once you have you received a rope from Shimaoka-sensei.
Yes, I did. Yeah, number of them.
I think, and you still keep those
Yeah,
very carefully.
I still use them. Not so much on, so many pots, but I still use them on Unomis and other pots, and beautiful labor intensive technique. And
I remember you telling me you don't even allow your wife Jan to touch them. Is that right? Or to use them?
I found a obi cord maker in Tennessee, in fact, Carolyn, who was able to make some obi cords for Jan. So she has her own now.
I just wanted to add that this is the last of the rope pattern pieces we're going to look at. Apologize because we have 2 more pieces that we couldn't resist including. So those of you that need to leave, fine. I also want to make one note before you do, that this is the first of any of the webinars we've ever done where the number of people who were attending increased as we went along with it. So that's pretty amazing as to having it decrease as people fall asleep. Let's look at this wonderful, wonderful bottle. And Andrew, Randy, Caroline, whoever wants to speak about the sense of absolute freedom and joy, and it's almost like dancing visually in front of me.
It goes back to Andrew, commenting on how, and yourself, Bernie, how Shimaoka employed workers, Shokinin-san, who probably, with training, could be taught how to press mold form like this, and then Shimaoka would throw the neck on it and of course do all the decoration. But it added a beautiful extension to the possibilities of pieces and forms that were produced by the pottery for sale and to support everybody's life. Minge is an interesting word and brought forward by Yanagi and Hamada and Shimaoka. None of these men were not intellectuals. They were very smart men, and they were certainly not unknown craftsmen as they moved forward in their life and received international recognition. But they carried forth that idea of the art of the people in a beautiful way.
Beautifully said. Andrew, do you want to speak briefly about this?
Yeah, I really like this piece. Very different in that it doesn't have the rope impressions on it, but he does use the slip on this piece. And in fact, down the center of this side, I think he's used a brush to swirl around down the side of the piece, and then took not overglazed enamel, but I think that's an actual pigment, copper pigment, and a black, probably iron-based pigment. I'm not sure, Randy, you would know.
It is a copper. It's a copper red.
Yeah, but the black.
Iron. Yeah, iron, I think.
Yeah, to create these little flowers. So it's a very sort of almost, impressionistic type of floral pattern that he's added there to the side in a different, subtle way compared with his other pieces.
And
really
finally,
beautiful.
the last piece, Caroline, if you don't mind. And I'd like you to speak just a bit about it, and then we'll have some final comments from the other gentleman.
I think his work outside of him, where it's coming from. You can't not look at these pieces and think it's not art. I mean, it's art. It's easy. You can just see it and tell, right? You can't say it's not, and you can't say it's not pottery either. I think it destroys that whole, some people might say it's like, well, is pottery art? Is it craft? I mean, that separation, I don't think exists. And I think his work just elegantly shows that. It's not trying to even do that. It just does it. It just exists in that way. And this piece is really a good example, because it's just got so much going on in those sweet, probably the rice motif in the center.
Andrew?
Yeah. Is it sculpture? Yes. Is it vessel? Yes. Is it painted decoration? Yes, it is. It's all of those things. And the wonderful thing about Shimaoka-san's work, which was part of what the committee was looking at when they gave him the title Living National Treasure, was does his pieces have the presence to command your attention? Apart from the various techniques and use of tradition, invocations of traditional pieces and that sort of thing, which are also considerations. But is this work that we want to represent Japanese culture to the nation and to the world? I think we've seen in the pieces that we've been looking at that Shimaoka-san's work was definitely of that caliber, and warranted his designation as a living national treasure.
Randy?
Yeah, this was Mara's piece. So if Mara's listening, even though she's ill, I remember her kind of reflecting her surprise and joy when she saw this piece. It's a very painterly piece. Shimaoka was an incredible individual, and he bridged and brought forward, I think, from Hamada and Yanagi's generation. He brought forward the spirit of Minge into the modernist contemporary world and transcended into our century. I remember him sitting at our dining room table, and he and his daughter arguing about his age, and she said, "You're 88, Dad." And he said 87, and she said, "You're 88, Dad." He says 87 and a half. And he, reflecting that humor, he made work for a long time, and from 1939 until the early part of this century. And his work went through many transitions, but carried a specific style and technique forward and refined it. And that's, as Andrew said, that's why he was recognized as a Nengen no Kokuho, the living national treasure of Japan. Great honor.
Let me just end by a couple of notes, one of which was when he was in Boston, he gave a lecture at Mass College of Art. And instead of speaking about his work, he only spoke about Hamada's work and the tradition, what Hamada represented through his work, and really saw himself as a messenger carrying it forward. So aligned with what both Andrew and Randy both said, he was aware of that tradition and that he was continuing it in a very meaningful way. And everyone who was there was just stunned, because they were hoping, I think, to hear more about his work, but that was not his role at that moment. So quite extraordinary. And I just want to end with a thank you to all of you. I had anticipated this being a really extraordinary opportunity, and it was even more. So to Randy, to Andrew, and to Caroline, thank you so much. I would be remiss if I didn't at least share one Brother Thomas quote, which I tend to do with all of these things. What is old and beautiful is always new, and what is beautiful and new is always old. And I think Shimaoka helped us understand the value of respecting your traditions, and at the same time, the opportunity as an artist to add to that, to enrich it, and to respect it. So thank you everyone for your patience, for staying longer than we expected. I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope you did. Thank you.